The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Madam Speaker, I'm very proud to rise in this House to speak on the bill for the implementation of CETA and to speak, Madam Speaker, about the ideology of trade that's being promoted by the Liberal government. Not the facts of trade, but an ideology of trade. We see there the Prime Minister has become the world's great last free trader, pumping this idea that if we keep opening the ability of corporations to move wherever they want, then we'll all benefit. And as we're dealing with CETA, he's already putting up trial balloons of what's going to be on the table with the Trump government over NAFTA, and of course they're looking towards the TPP. So let's look at this, Madam Speaker, in terms of simple economics. Economics should be like an ecosystem. And in a healthy ecosystem, that you have a broad, defined levels of support and abilities, whether it's the small manufacturer, the individual business, up the food chain. What we see with our Prime Minister is this belief that if you look after those at the top of the food chain, somehow everyone will benefit. He's the last and the ultimate promoter of the trickle-down economics theory, which is about why I wanted to talk about his ideology of trade. We're told that this, earlier today we were told by a Liberal that this was about allowing little farmers in Nova Scotia to sell blueberries in Europe, which of course is a ridiculous side issue, but it's not nearly as ridiculous as the member for University Rosedale who on CBC said this was about mucklucks. You know, that she had these indigenous mucklucks from Winnipeg and she gave them to the European Trade Commissioner because it's about allowing little muckluck manufacturers to trade internationally. Now, that would be really ridiculous if it wasn't for this government who believe everyone is as dumb as a selfie photo message, because that's not what the trade agreements are. If the trade agreements were to allow the development of small business and allow larger, that's good trade. But what we see is these trade agreements that they don't want to talk about are protecting, again and again, those at the top of the food chain, and that's where trade agreements have to be discussed and challenged. For example, we see that under this government, once again, the complete support for the investor-state provisions. Now, the investor-state provisions we've seen time and time again be used as the tools to limit the tools of local and regional governments to actually respond to economic issues. We were told when free trade first came in that it would make us citizens of the world, that we would all be able to travel and do, and we wouldn't be bound by our local economies. But what we've become in many of our regions in this country are orphaned economies because the trade agreements take away the abilities to respond in times of crisis, and that's when you need government involved in an economy. So let me give you an example. This was the provincial Liberal, so the same forces that are behind this Prime Minister come from the Kathleen Wynne government. So for anyone who's not in Ontario, be warned, this is not going to end well. So in 2013, the Wynne government decided that they would show that they were ready for free trade by taking local rural bus contracts for school bus lines and opening them up to international investors. So in my region, which is a large rural area, we had all these little mom-and-pop operations that maybe had 2 or 3 buses doing rural schools, and the Francophone School Board, the English School Board, and suddenly they had to compete against a large European consortium that underbid every single one of them and put them all out of business. And then, well, some of them got rehired as bus drivers for this large European consortium. But we were told those sacrifices are important because trade is important. It's as G.K. Chesterton's talked about, the horrible mysticism of money, the false mysticism of trade, that we have to sacrifice all these little small school bus operations for the bigger vision of trade. So how does that benefit us? Well, it doesn't. So we see that in the investor-state provisions, they maintain those. On the fact that we're giving up on the pharmaceuticals. Now, that's supposed to help us so we can sell mucklucks. But it will cost us, what is it, up to $2.8 billion a year that will be downloaded to individual consumers on the cost of pharmaceuticals. But that's all important because it's for the ideology of trade. The attack on the dairy sector is crucial issues because we're talking about family farms. We're talking about regional farming economies that have proven a pattern of success, that are giving up market share. Now, at least the Harper government was willing to compensate for the impacts because they knew those impacts would be great. But what we get from this government, instead of actual money on the table, is we get the Bobby McFerrin School of Economics, which is saying, don't worry, be happy. We have a prime minister who will do push-ups for you in Brooklyn, and your farm sector will somehow compete. And we know that that's not true. So they're more than willing to sacrifice individual jobs. We see zero words from this Prime Minister over Chinese steel dumping that shut down Sault Ste. Marie and is crushing Hamilton. Why are they not speaking up? Well, because in the interests of trade with China, it's okay that they destroy our steel sector. The fact that this Prime Minister, after holding his private billion-dollar fundraisers with Chinese billionaires, decides to open up for review a project about allowing the Chinese government to buy a Canadian tech company that even the Harper government opposed. Why would we sell out our tech sector? Well, it's for the greater vision of trade. It will benefit us all. We see that the Trump government, as soon as Donald Trump came in, he started talking about opening up NAFTA. He hadn't even noticed Canada existed. And the Prime Minister said, brilliant, we'll come to the negotiating table and reopen the negotiations with you. Now, Madam Speaker, if you're going to negotiate a deal, you don't hold up your ace cards and show where they are in your hand. But no, they've already started to talk about they're going to bring Brian Mulroney. God help us. They're going to bring Brian Mulroney in to give this Prime Minister advice. And what does Brian Mulroney say? Brian Mulroney says, hey, we got to get rid of supply management. If you're not going to send a message that this is going to be on the table, I mean, who are they representing? They're not representing us. You're going to have the Prime Minister bring Brian Mulroney in, and he's already posting bubbles about what we're going to give up. I mean, this is like, Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister, when it comes to international trade, he's like a rube at a country fair. He thinks he knows where those dollars are going to land in the little shells, but he's setting us up for failure. We have seen him say nothing about softwood. We have lost so many forestry jobs because of softwood. We've seen him say nothing about the fact that the United States, if they're going to stand up for their interests, we have to stand up for ours. But the Prime Minister's already opened the door to putting these on the table. And why is it? It's because his notion of economics that he studied at school is that as long as we keep allowing trade to move back and forth, we will all benefit. But we're seeing, Madam Speaker, now where 60% in urban areas are on short-term contracts. Where is this middle class they keep talking about? We hear them all the time, and it's a very insidious language they use. They talk about everything as the middle class and those wanting to join it, as though that they're offering a long-term vision of development when they're not, because they continually favor those at the top of the food chain. And what do I mean by that? Well, look at their tax break for middle class and working people. If you make $23 an hour or less, you get zero. But if you make $50 or $100 an hour, you get full bang. Now, I guess the Prime Minister grew up in a different middle class than I did. But most of the middle class people I know who are just trying to get into the middle class, at $23 an hour, they could use a break rather than the ministers of cabinet and bankers. But this is the false ideology of their economics. But they have the nerve and the gall to say they're doing it to sell blueberries, that they're here for the mucklucks. They're there for the little Joe on the street with his mom-and-pop corner operation. That's why we're signing these international agreements, and that's false. So if we're going to talk trade, then let's talk about trade that's in Canada's interests, that we're talking about ensuring that our pharmaceutical costs are not going to go through the roof to sell that out, that we're going to talk about investor-state provisions that are based on a clear, coherent rule of law and not just a backroom deal that undermines the ability of local and regional governments and provincial governments to do the decisions that they have a right to make. This is about what trade needs to be. But unfortunately, with the trickle-down Prime Minister, you know what's happening to the people on the bottom, and we're seeing it again and again and again. And I'll finally conclude, Madam Speaker, the one honest statement that the Liberal government made today was they thanked the Conservatives for leading the way, because they really appreciated the roadmap that was laid out by the Conservative policies, and they're just trying to faithfully follow it. Now, I don't agree with the Conservatives much, but what I do like about them is at least they give it to us straight in the face. They tell us where they stand. They don't try and hug us and act like Teletubbies when they're delivering what they're delivering. So at least the Liberals had the decency to thank the Conservatives for this economic travesty that they continue to perpetrate on the Canadian